nice to be back, seeing you, at least by Zoom, and hopefully in the not too distant future in person would be very nice too. Oh, for some reason this has skipped ahead. There we go. Yeah, so the title of my talk is The Phenomenal Character of Visual Imagery and Visual Perceptual Experience. So the question that I want to address today is the question of whether the difference between visual perceptual experience and visual imagery is one of degree or one of kind. And, this has been a debate in philosophy for several hundred years. It's not a new debate at all, but I hope to shed a little bit of new light onto it. So a kind, I take it, is a group of things that share similar characteristics, and a difference in degree is a difference of magnitude along one or more dimensions. So what I want to do today is to present not all the reasons at all, but to present some reasons to think that the difference between visual perceptual experience and visual imagery is not one of a difference of kind. And I'm also going to be presenting some reasons, but again, certainly not all the reasons, to think that the difference in degree is even less than is standardly conceived. And then thirdly, I'm going to present, again, some, but not all reasons, to think that actually some cases cannot be classified as either perceptual or imagistic in some non-arbitrary fashion. These cases have some features of paradigmatic perception, and they have some features of paradigmatic imagery. And basically, there's no non-arbitrary way of making a decision and deciding to say, well, there's enough on the side of perception that's perception, or there's enough on the side of imagery to be imagery. Rather, I think that we should just be open about the fact that they are interesting and unusual conditions in cases that we should just note that they're to some degree like perception, to some degree like imagery, but that we can really say no more than that. And en route, we're going to see that spelling out the different features of perceptual experience and perceptual imagery is difficult and complex. So the focus of this talk is on the nature of conscious experiences had during perception and imagery. So I'll set aside the following questions, whether there can be something like unconscious imagery. That's a view that's been promoted quite a lot at the moment by Benson Nani. So I'm just going to ignore that and focus on conscious imagery. Whether you think that's all the imagery, I'm not worried about. And I'm not going to think about whether there can be unconscious perception. Again, I'm thinking about conscious visual experiences, so I'm thinking of conscious states. I'm also not going to be thinking about the question of whether hallucination is the same type of experience as perception. Some people think it is, some people think it isn't. I think that one can raise interesting questions in general about whether the difference between perception and hallucination is one of kind or one of degree, and whether there are states that might be hard to classify as either one or the other, and so on. So there's obviously ties here to thinking about that question and what I'm talking about, but today I'm just setting that question aside. If I'm talking today about perceptual experience, unless I explicitly say otherwise, then take that to be a good case, what philosophers call the good case, basically a case of veridical or accurate perception of the world, however you want to put that. And to begin with, what I'm going to do is to give you a rough outline of what I take this continuum view, the view that says there's a difference of degree between perceptual experience and perceptual imagery. I'm going to explain several different varieties of that view, and then we'll go on and look at the view that says there's a difference of kind, and then I'll sort of briefly say what my view is, and then I'll go on to argue for it. Okay. So when we think about the difference between perception and imagery, there are various different sort of dimensions that people have thought about. So probably the most famous is this first dimension, the vividness dimension. So as we all know, the good Scottish philosopher David Hume told us that the difference between perceptual experience and imagery is one of degree, and they differ in respect of vividness. So we're told that perceptual experiences are the more vivid, so they live here on the left-hand side. The imaginative experiences are less vivid, they live here on the right-hand side, but this is one of degree. It's a difference of degree. There's this kind of more or less vividness that experiences have, and the way to separate them out, the way to tell which are the perceptual ones is you look at the vivid ones, and which are the imaginative ones, you look at the not vivid ones. Now, some people have spoken about, sorry, before I get on to that, Hume just focused in on this one criterion and said that's the criterion that distinguishes perception and imagination. Other people might focus in on a different criterion. So some people might say, well, actually, what's important is that the perceptual experiences have determinate content and the imaginative experiences do not have determinate content. Some people have said that the perceptual experiences are the ones that present objects as really existing within our experience or have this what's called sense of reality to them. And the imaginative experiences differ in degree because they don't have such a sense of reality or they don't present objects as being present. And again, this is thought of as a spectrum where you find the perceptual ones up at one end and you find the imaginative ones down the other end. Another thing that people have said is that perceptual experiences are either not voluntary or don't feel voluntary. Sometimes people make both those claims. Other people say the imaginative experiences are voluntary and or feel voluntary. And unlike the first three, which are phenomenological criterion, I put this dimension in purple to indicate that you can take a non-phenomenological reading of this to ask whether it is voluntary or isn't voluntary, or you can take a phenomenological reading of this to say, does it feel voluntary or does it not feel voluntary? And then the last criterion down here in blue is a non-phenomenal criterion. And here people say something like, well, look, the difference between perception and imagination, certainly it's one of degree, and it's one of degree where we ask, what is it that determines either whether you have the state at all, or what is it that determines what the content of the state is? And if the answer is the way the world is, then you have a perceptual experience. If you answer, it's what's going on inside me, inside my head, or inside me, then that's an imaginative experience. Nonetheless, these people think this is a difference of degree, and the people who've sort of historically held that view are Jastrow, Savage, Nigel Thomas, and David Souza. Now, someone might think that actually all of these criteria are relevant, and I mean, I think all of these criteria are relevant, for example, and they would say something like, well, look, there are all these criteria, and the more that we find a state on the left-hand side in the rankings, the more we should say it's a perceptual experience. The more we find it on the right-hand side of these rankings, the more that we should think it's an imaginative experience. Now, contrasting with this view is a view that says these aren't actually sort of degrees of difference between perceptual states and imaginative states. The idea is that there's some sharp conceptual difference that marks a difference in kind, where you take perceptual experiences to be vivid and imaginative experiences just not to be vivid. You take perceptual experiences to be determinate, imaginative experiences not to be determinate. Mohan Martin has recently argued that the key thing that differentiates perceptual experience and imaginative experience is that the perceptual experiences are the ones that represent the world being there in front of you. The imaginative experiences do not do that. They do not present objects as existing in front of you. So there's a sharp, on his view, there's a sharp conceptual distinction between the two sorts of states.
Hello. Hey, Rob.
I think someone just interrupted by accident, so I'll continue on. On this voluntary dimension, people historically like Sartre and today someone like Jonathan Ishikawa says that the perceptual experiences are ones that are the ones that are not voluntary, and Ishikawa says don't feel voluntary. The imaginative ones are the ones that are voluntary and that feel voluntary. But for him, that's not a difference of degree, it's a sharp difference of kind. And then many scientists really focus in on this criterion about what determines the world. They think that perceptual experiences are the ones determined by the world and the way the world is, and the imaginative ones are the ones that are determined by me. Okay, so that's the kind of two opposing views out there. And again, someone might focus in on one or other of these criteria, but other people might sort of try and use them all together as a package. So on my view, I think that there are perception and imagination-like states that occupy the opposite and intermediate parts of these dimensions. So, for example, I think we can find ranking very high on the vividness dimension, but otherwise, say, ranking very high on the imaginative dimension. And we will find cases where states just rank in the intermediate positions along these dimensions. And of these kinds of states, trying to determine whether they're perception or imagination just would result in us making arbitrary decisions that wouldn't be very good. You know, I don't think that we can sort of somehow draw a line along here in some principled fashion, and nor do I think that we can choose between these criteria in a principled fashion. So I just think that we have to recognize that there are states that are a bit like paradigmatic perception in some respects, a bit like imagination in some respects, a bit like, and a bit in the middle. So I really want to sort of push this view that we're really going to find no principled way to divide up all the candidate states into clearly perceptual or clearly imaginative. So let me give you now my reasons for thinking that so. So let's start by thinking about, one thing to say first before I launch in here is, my focus here is really going to be on the phenomenal character dimensions, but I will be mentioning some of these other dimensions as we go. And as I said, I'm just presenting some reasons here, not all the reasons. So I think there's a lot more to be said than what I'm saying here. Okay, but let me focus in on these cases, which I've been thinking a lot about recently. So David Hume famously said that the difference between visual imagery and visual experience is that imagery is less what he called vivid and lively. And these words have echoed down the ages, and almost every philosopher and every scientist says these words. The imagery experiences are less vivid and lively than the perceptual experiences. So it's clear that to many people, these words strike a chord and point towards a really key or important phenomenal difference between typical visual experience and typical visual imagery. However, to the extent it is true that visual imagery is less lively and vivid, it's not a generalization without exceptions. So it has quite recently come to light that there are people who have a condition called hyperphantasia, and they report in something called the VVIQ, the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, that their imaginative experience is every bit as vivid as perceptual experience. And people who rank on the VVIQ as having this incredibly vivid imaginative experience, we can correlate that with both neural and behavioral differences that these people demonstrate compared to people who have normal imagery and people who have aphantasia. That's a lack of imagery. So it seems like when it comes to hyperphantasia, we have what we would think of as imaginative experiences, but we have to sort of push them up on the vividness scale here. And in fact, people with hyperphantasia say that their imagery experiences are every bit as vivid as their perceptual experiences. And likewise, to the extent that it's generally true that perceptual experience is vivid, there are a range of more and less vivid perceptual experiences. So, you know, perhaps the most vivid experience you might sort of think of if you're thinking of a visual experience is, you know, an experience of a carnival with bright lights and so on. That certainly seems a more vivid perceptual experience than an experience of a drab council estate. And again, that seems more vivid than an experience of a misty Scottish loch in the morning. So these are cases where states that we think of as perceptual experiences aren't very vivid, and we need to push them along the dimension towards the right. So because of these cases of imagery and perceptual experience, I don't think that we can use vividness as a defining characteristic that lets us identify and distinguish perceptual experience from imagery experience. And the general claim about them actually differing in degree is really put under severe pressure. But I think that even worse than this is that there's reason to think that it's not actually literally true, with my emphasis on literally true, that perceptual experience is more vivid and lively than imagery. even if you sort of take an intuitive sort of understanding of that. So even figuring out what these terms, vivid and lively, are supposed to mean here is incredibly difficult. And I think that the way a lot of the scientific literature does it is hugely misguided. So consider the term lively. Experience is not literally lively. It's not alive and it's not jumping around or anything like that. So any use of the word lively here is metaphorical. It's not really clear at all in my book how we can say non-metaphorically what actually is meant by lively here. Even though a lot of people want to say, oh yeah, Hume's right, it's vivid and lively. Actually, when you start to reflect on, well, what actually does lively mean here, I think it's very difficult to say anything at all. And moreover, consider the term vivid. It's certainly true that the content of an experience can be more or less vivid in a very straightforward use of that term, meaning colourful and bright. And of course, you might extend the use of that term then to speak of the corresponding experiences of those scenes as more or less vivid. So if you have an experience, let's say a perceptual experience of a carnival has vivid content, you might think, well, that licenses you saying the experience is vivid. And if you have a perceptual experience that doesn't have very vivid content of the misty loch in the morning, then you might think, well, the content isn't very vivid there, so maybe you could call the experience not very vivid. So one often sees the following sorts of diagrams in scientific pictures. So you get these images labeled 1 to 6. Obviously, number 6 is bright and sharp and vivid image, let's say, and they get decreasingly less vivid and lively, one might say, as you go down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you might think, just as image 6 is more vivid than image 3, so too you might say that your visual experience of 6 is more vivid than your visual experience of 3. Now you can also imagine each of these images, and this you might think would yield a series of more and less vivid imagery experiences. So if I imagine picture 6, you might think, well, the content's more vivid, so the experience is more vivid than my experience when I'm imagining picture 3. So far, you might think, that's unproblematic. Good, this seems fine. But the claim that we're asked to consider is that imagery is less vivid than perceptual experience. And now we've got the question, well, how is that claim supposed to be made true? One question you might think of here is, well, is the idea supposed to be something like this? When I visually imagine 6, the imagery experience I have is equivalent to that had when I see image 3. Is that the idea? Well, this is certainly an idea that a lot of contemporary imagery science endorses, because they use these pictures of horses to ask people to rate their imagery of a horse. So they ask people to imagine a horse in a field, and then they present them with those 6 images, and then they say, which one of these is most similar to your imagery? So they're sort of suggesting to people that when they look at 6 and imagine what they're seeing in 6, that actually their experience is like their perceptual experience of 3. You see these diagrams in terms of pictures of apples in a similar way. Here's the imagination spectrum. We were asked, imagine an apple, visually imagine an apple, and then subjects are asked to rate 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, how vivid is your imagery experience. So people are being asked to rate their imagery experience against their visual experience of these sorts of images. However, the idea that when I visually imagine 6, the imagery experience I have is equivalent to that had when I see 3, I think is completely misguided. When I imagine 6, my imagery is not like seeing 3, because what it's like to see 3 is what it's like to see a horse in dark fog. And when I imagine 6, I don't imagine a horse in dark fog, I imagine a horse in bright sunlight. The point can be brought home further. If imagining 6 is like seeing 3, then imagining 5 should be like seeing 2, and imagining 4 should be like seeing 1. But clearly an experience as of 1, a black box, doesn't represent a horse at all. And if I imagine one, what is my experience supposed to be like then? Is it like seeing something less black? Is it like seeing something grey or seeing something white? Why on earth would that amount to imagining black? I think this just shows that the position is utterly untenable. So while it's true that people are quite happy to agree that imagery is less vivid than perceptual experience, vivid doesn't mean vivid in the ordinary literal sense, meaning bright or deep colour, in the way that's often depicted in allegedly illustrative diagrams. And you might think at this point, well, can we look to the dictionary for help here? Like, are we just kind of missing out on some sense of vivid that doesn't mean, a bright and deep color or something like that? Well, I went away and did that. And the answer is there's no help there either. We're given a meaning to do with bright colors and perhaps some lack of blurriness. And we're told that this can apply to imagery too, but nothing more illuminating is given. There's certainly nothing that's said about a comparison between perceptual experience and imagery. So it seems like we're stuck with not really understanding what it is for a perceptual experience to be more vivid and lively than imagery, understanding only on some sort of intuitive level, and moreover, not actually being able to explain to someone who's never experienced imagery what it's like to have it. So it's always of interest to me that when people who have visual imagery hear of aphantasia, they sort of puzzle and ponder, how could you have a mind that doesn't have perceptual imagery? But the same is true on the other side. When you meet people who have aphantasia and don't have imagery, they say, how on earth can you create images in your own mind? That seems like a magical thing to be able to do. And they don't have a good sense of what it's like to have visual imagery. And simply being told that imagery is less vivid and lively doesn't really help them very much, because that's not to be taken in a literal sense. So I think that's a kind of instructive point. And in any case, as I've argued above, we can't use vividness as a defining characteristic that lets us identify and distinguish perceptual experience from imagery experience, because there are just loads of counterexamples to that. So let's then turn to examine the other phenomenological criteria to see whether they help us distinguish perceptual experience and imagery, and even also to understand actually what it's like to have imagery. And in doing so, I'll leave it up to you to have a think about whether you think something like determinateness or whether you think something like a sense of reality are actually what we should be using to capture what vividness means. I'm not going to comment on that further. So I think some people think that actually you can capture a sense of vividness and lack of vividness by thinking about determinateness and sense of reality. But because of time, I'll leave that question open. So lots of people have said that imagery is less determinate than perceptual experience. Being less determinate amounts to representing things in a less specific manner. So for example, we can distinguish between a determinable property and its determinations. That's the properties which determine it. For example, the property of a square determines the property of having a shape. The property of being crimson and the property of being scarlet each determine the property of being red. So typically when I see a horse, I experience a lot of detail, the precise colour of its coat in light and shadow, the location of all the bits of the hair in the mane and so on, so as long as I'm suitably close to it and so on, the position of the legs and so on. I suppose not when it's standing in such tall grass, but forgive me for the particular picture here. Now when I imagine a horse, it certainly seems intuitive to me to say that the imagery often seems to represent less. So exactly where the shadows fall, whether indeed there are shadows, what the precise colour of the coat of the horse is, where each wisp of hair is, simply might not be represented in the imagery. And indeed, Daniel Dennett has claimed that you can visually imagine an object without imagining it to have any particular colour at all. And all this, I would say, reflects my own imagery experience, which I take to be pretty standard imagery experience. And so I'm quite happy to agree that at least typically imagery is less determinate than perceptual experience. But note that there are cases of not very determinate perceptual experience. Foggy scenes, seeing the loch on the misty morning, seeing a near object out of focus because you're focused on things far beyond it, and so on, are examples. Indeed, elsewhere, I myself have argued that just as Dennett's conception of visual imagery has it that visual imagery needn't represent colour at all, I think that there can be visual experiences that don't represent colour at all, thus they're very indeterminate with respect to colour. Note also that there are cases of quite determinate imagery. For example, that had during very focused imagery exercises, cases of hyperphantasia. So here my evidence is not based on scientific studies of hyperphantasia, because there are not very many of those. It's really based on personal discussion, talking to people who have hyperphantasia and asking them in as much detail as I'm able about their phenomenology. The only scientific work on this talks about how vivid their imagery is, but when I talk to them about whether their experience they would say is very determinate and explain what I mean by that, they sign up to yes, their experience being very determinate. Another interesting case are cases of what are called flashbacks, which are had sometimes when people have PTSD, on the assumption that their experience at that point really does involve imagery rather than perceptual experience. And obviously there's some debate over that case. I'll come to say a little bit more about that case later. But for those people who think that what's going on there is people are having very vivid imagery, then obviously it is vivid and people report very determinate imagery. So while as a gross generalization, it seems true to say that determinateness differentiates perceptual experiences and imagery, it cannot be a defining criterion that lets us identify which is which, because we have examples that don't fall into that general pattern. So now I want to turn to think about this third phenomenological criterion, that is the sense of reality. So Dockich and Martin in a 2017 paper distinguish the sense of reality from the sense of having mediated or unmediated acquaintance with something, such as through or on a TV or VR headset. So they classify both what they call the sense of reality and the sense of unmediated acquaintance as both forms of perceptual presence. And then focusing in on the sense of reality, they say that this is the sense that the perceptual object is real, that is, belongs to the actual world rather than a merely possible world or even an impossible world. So that's what I want to focus in on here. I'm not talking about whether you seem to have mediated or unmediated access to an object, but whether it seems to you that the object is in the world rather than a possible world or even an impossible world. So that's what I'm talking about here when I talk about the sense of reality. So the idea is that perceptual experience presents objects and properties existing here and now in the actual world. And it's often said that imagery doesn't do that. It presents us with a way that the world could be, not a way that the world is. It tells us not how things are, but how they might be. And there's an interesting debate about how the sense of presence manifests itself in our experience. So variously, it is claimed that it's part of the content of experience, or that it's part of the attitudinal nature of the state, or that it is a metacognitive feeling. So let me say a little bit more about that. So for some people, your experience, your perceptual experience, part of the content would be something like, there is a mug that is in the real world in front of me here and now, something like that. For other people, it's part of the attitudinal nature of the state. So those people would think of a perceptual experience as propositional attitude-like, and then they would build the sense of reality into the attitude. So the attitude would be something like, it is manifest to me that here and now there is, and then you put in the content of the state, a cup in front of me or something like that. And then a third view is that it's a metacognitive feeling. So you say something like, well, you have this imagery experience, and then it can be accompanied by this feeling that things that are presented to you in your experience are really present in front of you. So again, I think that while it might be true as some kind of gross generalization that perceptual experience has this sense of reality and imagery experience does not, there are notable exceptions, and detailed explication of this criterion is lacking in the literature. So one nice case to think about, one that Dockich and Martin think about, is what's called derealization disorder. So Dockich and Martin cite Jaspers as noting that the sense of reality tends to be taken for granted until it is disturbed pathologically. And so it's only, if you like, then that we appreciate that it exists. So derealization has many causes and occurs in both the clinical and non-clinical population. Common to both of those sort of populations is the experience that the world does not seem real or actual to people anymore. So this is typically reported as a case where perceptual experience lacks a sense of reality. However, when considering derealized perception, Mohan Matin has objected to this, and I'm told that his view here is similar to that of Husserl, but I know nothing of Husserl, so I'm only reporting to you that some people have said this. Okay, so Mohan Matin argues, in normal visual perception, the scene is not simply imagined, but seems to present the perceiver's own surroundings as so. I will refer to this as the feeling of presence. And he goes further and says that the feeling or sense of presence is essential to or constitutive of perceptual experience. And this is because he thinks it's part of the attitudinal nature of the state. So he thinks what makes a perceptual state is that the attitude is something like it is present in my environment that a mug is on the table or something like that. So when we think of derealization experience, Mohan Matin must think that it does not involve having perceptual experience because it lacks this sense of reality. And you might speculate that he would think that it involves imagery experience, imagery that no less is or imagery that is nonetheless driven by external stimuli. In opposition to this view, Dockich and Martin claim that the sense of presence is a mere metacognitive feeling that typically accompanies perceptual experience, but that needn't. They claim that it's not essential to perceptual experience to have this sense of presence, and provide reasons to think that those with derealized disorder do in fact perceive the world. So forgive me for the slightly longer quote here, but it's quite illustrative. They say, derealized patients have intact perceptual competencies. They do not seem to have any problems pertaining to the identification or recognition of the perceived objects. Their ventral systems are functioning well, and their sensory motor abilities are apparently impeccable. Their dorsal systems are also functioning well. They do not have any known perceptual deficit, such as agnosia or ataxia. It is empirically plausible that they have genuine perceptual experiences of the world. So we have Dockich and Martin saying, these people's experiences is driven by the way the world is. They can identify the world. The perception is not, impaired. It's perceptual experiences that lack a sense of reality. Mohan Matin is saying, because these experiences lack a sense of reality, they're not perception, they're imagery. So what should we make of this debate? Well, clearly any sensible person shouldn't dispute the empirical facts that Dockich and Martin cite about the lack of deficits in derealization, and no doubt Mohan Matin wouldn't either. But nor do I think that those facts would move him to change his mind. Dockich and Martin don't explicitly say it, but they seem to be suggesting that it's the following criterion that makes a perceptual experience, whether the world is causing that state and whether the way the world is causing the content of the state. That's why they're saying these people can identify objects. They can use their experience to know what's out there in the world in front of them. And they're saying that this criterion trumps the lack of sense of presence in determining that a perceptual experience is had. And Mohan Matin is suggesting the opposite. The lack of sense of presence trumps the fact that the world determines the state, thus determining a perceptual experience is not had. So how should we, looking in on this debate, choose between these different ways of characterising the experience that's had in derealised perception? Well, it seems to me that each view seems palatably, arbitrarily stipulative. If we don't want to engage in that practice, an alternative is to think that perceptual experience and imagery are not mental states that belong to distinct categories, but that simply differ in degree. And that would allow us to recognise that derealised perceptual experiences have two features that pull in different directions when we try to classify the state as either perception or imagery. But we can just note that fact and not choose between the perceptual view or the imagery view. We can simply label the state as being as some intermediate point on the perceptual imagery scale. So it seems to me if you were to think about derealised perception, well, the world seems to determine the way that state is. It doesn't seem to be voluntary. The sense of reality is not present. Determinateness, as far as we know, is fully present. There's no perceptual disorder. I wasn't sure where to put this experience on the vividness scale. If you think determinateness is vividness, you'd push it up here. I guess I put it in the middle because I thought vividness might be sort of determined by a mixture of determinateness and sense of reality. So I don't really know where this experience goes on the vividness scale. But even ignoring that piece of ignorance on my part, when you see the profile of this state, it just seems to me that, you know, there's no good way to choose whether this is perception or imagination. We should just note that it has characteristics of each. There's no way to privilege which dimension we should look at. We should look at them all and then just note this profile of the state. And in fact, I think that the feeling of reality criterion is actually far more complex than has been discussed thus far. That becomes evident when we start to think about to what extent imagery experience really does have a sense of presence or sense of reality or feeling of reality. So I've already spoken about hyperphantasia, where people have very vivid imagery. Hyperphantasics not only report vivid imagery, but they also have a poorer memory for what happened versus what was just imagined. And I think it's fairly likely that their imagery has more of a sense of reality than neurotypical imagery, but clearly more empirical work needs to be done on this topic, separating out different phenomenological elements of imagery and asking the hyperphantasics about them is much needed. But I would speculate that you would find that people with hyperphantasia, and in my experience informally asking people with hyperphantasia, they would say that there's that their imagery is very close to perception and in fact is sometimes mistaken by them for perception, therefore is quite similar on the sense of reality scale. Hallucinations and dreams are other interesting cases to think about here. These are often termed imagery by the scientific community because they're not driven by an external stimulus, at least to the extent or in the way that standard perception is. Yet often philosophers categorize these as perceptual experiences. Dreams are perceptual experiences, except you're just not hooked up to the world in the right way. And usually philosophers are doing that on phenomenological grounds. The phenomenology seems much like perceptual experience. The thought is it's just not the content or the phenomenology of the experience is just not driven by external stimuli, it's driven by internal stimuli. So we sort of get these sort of two contrasting views of what hallucinations or dreams are. There are philosophers and there are scientists who fall on either side of this divide, but some people think of these as imagery because they think the content is driven internally. Some people think these are perception because they think the phenomenology makes them more like perception than anything else. Now, again, I don't think that we have to choose between the imagery view or the perceptual view here. I think we can actually choose in a principled or for good reason. in a principled way or using good reason. I think that we just need to note the features that make these cases, hallucinations and dreams, somewhat like imagery, somewhat like perception, and then just place them in between as a kind of neither one nor the other type of case. Now I want to look at another kind of case which I find incredibly interesting. This is a case where we find, or at least some people claim, that we find imagery affecting our perceptual experience. So Benson-Nani, among others, has claimed that in amodal completion, imagery adds to perceptual experience. And I myself have, not focusing in on the case of amodal completion, just focusing in on perception more generally, have argued that I think imagery can sometimes add in content to our perceptual experience. So amodal completion typically occurs when part of an object is experienced as occluded and yet is reported as experienced as having a particular shape or boundary. So I love this photograph up here of I call it the footballer's long arm. So it looks like player 13 has this incredibly long arm. Obviously it's not, it's the hand end of the arm is the arm of number 9, but it just so beautifully lines up with player 13's extended arm that it kind of looks like one long arm. So this is a case of amodal completion. A portion of the arm appears to be occluded by player number 9 and player number 10, but nonetheless your experience represents that there's kind of one big long arm here behind the occluder. The case on the bottom here is the Koenigsegg triangle. And this is a nice figure because it contains both experiences of amodal and modal completion. So basically all this figure, if you like, really consists of are 3 Pac-Man-like figures and 3 angles here. However, most people don't report that that's what they experience when they experience this picture. Most people report that they see a lighter, brighter white triangle pointing upwards here. That's a case of modal completion because you experience the central triangle as having a brighter or lighter colour than the outside area here, and these edges seem to be given to you in your experience by means of a brightness or lightness boundary between the inside of the triangle and the outside of the triangle. So that's modal completion. Most people also say that they see a downward pointing triangle here that's occluded by that light bright triangle, and that's a case of amodal completion. So it seems to people as if these portions here are portions that join up to form a whole triangle, but you're not in any sense in your experience, well, let me rephrase that, you're not given the boundaries of the downward facing triangle in your experience in virtue of a lightness, colour or texture boundary in the way that you are with the upward pointing triangle. So in other words, unlike modal completion, the occluded amodally completed object's parts do not appear within our experience in virtue of a colour or lightness boundary. Yet in some sense, they still seem present because this does still look to most people as a whole downward pointing triangle. Excuse me. So Robert Briscoe has argued that while some cases of amodal perceptual experience may involve the addition of mental imagery to perceptual experience, some do not. So he thinks that there's 2 distinct kinds of amodally completed cases. Briscoe says, some cases of occlusion will draw on your beliefs about various items you have encountered in the past and what they look like for completion to occur. Those cases could involve imagery. So here's the kind of case he has in mind. So here's my, this is the limit of my computer imagery skills here. So here's a cat, and you can see that I've placed this black occluder in front of it. And most people would say that it doesn't look as if this cat has a very short, stubby tail that is cut off rather drastically. Most people would say they experience the tail as continuing on behind the occluder. You're not given the boundaries of that object in virtue of lightness or colour or anything like that. So this is a case of amodal completion. In fact, the tail is here. And now once you see it here, if we put the occluder back, it seems like now when you see this, you sort of experience the tail as dripping down to the right, whereas before perhaps you were sort of seeing it as sticking straight up, or perhaps it's curving forward. Who knows what you were seeing. But other cases are not like that kind of case. So this is again a figure by Knizia. And what we find in this case is that if you ask people to report what they see when they look at this middle image, most people report that what they experience is this bottom image with occluders on it. They don't report that they see an octagon, as in these flankers here. They report seeing an irregular hexagon that's occluded. So that's quite interesting because, you know, both this figure and this figure are equally good competitors, if you like, for being the figure here, yet everyone reports that it's this irregular hexagon that they experience. So Briscoe says of this sort of irregular hexagon type case, he says the amodal completed contours are unlike imagery because they are stimulus driven, they're stable in the absence of sustained effort and do not fade rapidly. They are not under volitional control, and they do not have visual or quasi-visual phenomenology. And he thinks that the cat case is different to this. He thinks it's not stimulus driven because you can, if you like, choose to experience the cat's tail in different positions. He thinks that case isn't very stable. He thinks this case is under your voluntary control. You can choose, if you like, where to see the cat's tail completing. Okay, so let's suppose that of this irregular hexagon case, let's suppose we agree that conditions 2 and 3 apply. It's not under volitional control, and let's suppose it is stable in the absence of sustained effort. Let's grant that. But one thing to think about here is, even if these features are true of that case, why shouldn't imagery have these sorts of features? For example, isn't the imagery postulated by some in post-traumatic stress disorder exactly not under volitional control and is actually stable in the absence of sustained effort and doesn't fade rapidly? After all, that's part of the problem of these conditions, is that people can't stop having that experience. And on being stimulus driven, well, occluded portions are determined by the surrounding context. So what is determining that you complete this contour here? Well, it's not, if you like, the contour itself, right? It's the whole surrounding features of the case. So the way in which the stimulus determines the content of your experience is a bit different to what happens in standard perception. In standard perception, it's what's going on in the ears that determines what you experience in the ears. It's what's going on in the mouth that determines what you experience in the mouth. Here, it's really the whole that determines how you complete this. It's not just what's going on in this small local area. So there is a difference in this respect. One of the things you might wonder about is whether this case is a bit like the kind of case where I tell you to imagine a cat. So people have noted that if you tell someone, you know, imagine an elephant, or indeed even better, don't imagine an elephant, people cannot but help but imagining elephants in these kinds of cases. So let's suppose that's true and I say to you, don't imagine an elephant. It seems like it's the way the world is that has caused you to imagine an elephant, and indeed to imagine an elephant. Is that what's going on in this kind of case? There's a kind of non-standard way of the world determining the content of your experience in a certain respect. So in other words, I kind of think of this case as a kind of intermediate case. The content is determined by the world, but not in the standard way. Just like in the case where I tell you, don't imagine an elephant. In that case, the content of your experience is determined by the world, just not in the standard way. So what about property 4? The amodal completion does not have visual or quasi-visual phenomenology. Well, Briscoe thinks that amodal completion doesn't affect the phenomenology of our visual experience. Briscoe thinks amodal completion does affect the phenomenology of our vision, mainly through the representation of unity, but he doesn't think the occluded portions are in our experience in a quasi-visual way. So he'll say when looking at this picture, well, sure, it looks like it completes as an irregular hexagon, but that's just because there's a sense of unity between this area here and a particular portion of the object under the occluder, but it's not like the portion that's under the occluder is given in our experience in a quasi-visual way. However, I don't think that's the right thing to say here. I mean, it's true that amodal completion doesn't have the sort of quasi-visual phenomenology that modal completion has. It's true that you're not given this sort of boundary area between the irregular hexagon and its background in terms of a lightness or brightness boundary. But I don't think that that's the only way in which an area can feature within the phenomenology of your experience. So similar to the case of typical visual imagery, in amodal completion, you're clearly not experiencing the full contour or occluded part of the object as you would do in a standard perceptual experience. Yet in some sense, you are visually aware of the contour and the occluded part. In fact, if you weren't aware that the contour is such that forms a point here and forms a point here, why would you be saying that this looks like an irregular hexagon as opposed to a regular octagon? So I think that this makes amodal completion actually pretty like visual imagery in respect of phenomenology. You're not presented with the boundary in virtue of present lightness or brightness features, but nonetheless, you are presented with that area in your experience nonetheless. Now, at this point, someone might have an objection. You might say, well, actually, this is wrong. Amodal completion does not have the same phenomenal character as typical visual imagery. Why would you think that? Well, you might think that you seem to add something extra to your experience of this figure if you visually imagine the occluded portions of the black lines being present. And if you're doing some visually imagining, add something extra into seeing this picture, then what it's like to see this picture can't involve that visual imagining, because the visual imagining is something extra. Well, I would reply here that it's true that if I imagine that the black lines are not occluded, then I would certainly add something extra to my experience. But if I imagine that the black lines are occluded, then I would say I don't add anything extra to my experience. We experience the lines as occluded, and if I imagine the lines being present as occluded, it seems to me that that was already what my experience was representing. So it's true that I can do something more to add to my experience, but that would be to imagine unoccluded lines, and that's just not what we're talking about here. So it seems to me that the real question is, if we visually imagine black lines where the black lines seem to be occluded, do we add something extra to our experience? And my own experience says no. Thus, it's just not clear that amodal perceptual experience is different to imagery experience. Now, someone might complain here that imagining occluded black lines is simply something that's not possible in visual imagination. You might say the only way you can visually imagine black lines is to imagine them to be unoccluded. But I would argue that if you think this case is not explained by perceptual imagery, then this case precisely provides you with an example of how indeed it is possible to be perceptually aware of occluded things. And if you can imagine what it's like to look at this figure, then you would be imagining precisely being aware of a black line that is occluded. So now we might ask the question, do amodal completion experiences present their objects as existing? And here I think cases vary. So for example, if you look at this picture of a cat behind a picket fence, I would say, you know, if you were looking at a real cat here rather than the picture of the cat, but this is kind of the image that you know, this is a picture of the real life scene that you were looking at, then I would say it does look as if a whole cat is present and not just cat slices are present. It doesn't look like the occluded slices are present to be perceived in the way that the face, say, can be perceived, but the whole cat does seem present. In contrast with that, if you look at the Knizia figure and you look at the downward pointing triangle, at least once you become familiar with the figure and you've figured out how it works, so to speak, you come to realize that actually there really isn't a downward facing triangle present at all. There are only the 3 Pac-Man figures and the 3 angles. And therefore, this second type of amodal completion is quite like visual imagery in this respect. The occluded parts of the object are present in your experience, but you're not tempted to think that they are present in the world once you realize the illusory nature of this figure. So in short, different forms of amodal completion seem to have some features intermediate between perception and imagination. It's true that the case of looking at the cat's tail, which I'm calling amodal perception here, is a bit more like perception than the case of the occluded irregular hexagon figure, which I'm calling amodal imagination. It's true that this case is more like perception in some respects, and this case is more like imagination in some respects. But actually, these cases just kind of fall in the middle in all of these dimensions. And so we need to just recognize that. As in the case of derealized perception, I think that there's good reason to hold that they shouldn't be classified as one or the other, contra Nani and Briscoe. So Nani is saying that all these cases are imagination, Briscoe is saying these cases are perception, and okay, these cases might be imagination. I'm saying, actually, they're just cases that are in the middle, and that's all we can truly say. Otherwise, we're just making arbitrary distinctions about the criteria that are supposed to really determine the nature of perception and imagination. A final issue to mention concerning the sense of reality is that it can vary greatly within otherwise paradigmatically imagery experience when we reflect on the wide range of those experiences, and these cases are just often not discussed. So here's a range of things you can do in your visual imagination. You can have imagery of an apple being in the room that you are in a room that you are seeing, sitting on the table in front of you, a table which you are seeing. You can have imagery of an apple being through the wall on a table next door that you can't see, but where you imagine the apple and the next room as all being within your current egocentric visual point of view. And you can do that when you don't imagine the wall in front of you to be transparent, and you can do that when you do imagine the wall in front of you to be transparent. You can have imagery of an apple that is sitting in the next room from the position of somewhere in the next room, and so not from your current egocentric visual point of view. You can have imagery of an apple, but there be no particular place you imagine it to be. Perhaps you imagine it to be in a mental space that bears no relation to physical space. It's not that you're imagining it to be in some particular space in the physical world. And I think you can have imagery of an apple in a non-real place, a place you know fine well is not real, like fairyland. And many of these cases can have the following variants. Cases when you're imagining a particular apple that you believe exists, and cases where you're imagining a merely imaginary apple. And there can be cases when you believe that such an apple exists where you believe it to, where you imagine it to be. And there can be cases when you don't believe such an apple exists where you imagine it to be. And all of these cases vary in their sense of reality. And this is nicely demonstrated in cases in which you can be very surprised when what you visually imagine turns out not to be the case. So sometimes you have this kind of experience, you're looking at your laptop and you turn around for a few minutes and you look back and you were, visually imagining your laptop to be right there on the table in front of you, and when you turn around, your laptop's not there, and you can be very surprised that your laptop is not there. And we can get the opposite kinds of cases, in cases in which you can be very surprised when what you visually imagine turns out to be the case. So for example, Perhaps you might imagine that your bedroom is filled with flowers in some sort of little reverie that you're having. And then you open the door to your bedroom and it is in fact filled with flowers in just the way you were imagining. You can be very surprised in those kinds of cases. So to summarise, these cases show us that otherwise paradigmatically imagery experiences can actually vary along the dimension of the sense of reality for many reasons. So just to summarise everything very briefly, I presented some reasons to think that visual perceptual experience and visual imagery are not categorically different and differ less in degree than supposed, because there are many such states that exhibit some features of one perception and some of the other imagery, and there are cases that cannot be classified either as perception or imagery in a non-arbitrary fashion. Thus, we should not arbitrarily categorise such cases as being perception or imagination, but simply appreciate their non-categorical nature. And I hope that I've helped to illuminate the phenomenal character of various imagery and perceptual experiences, and those that can be neither classified as clearly one or the other. And that's me finished. Thank you very much.